Coming up next on Insights on PBS Hawaii, life in captivity, carrying confinement or abuse. Aloha, I'm Malia Maddock. Welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii, coming to you from the brand new Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Multimedia Studio at the entrance to Sand Island in Honolulu. For decades, marine parks, hotels, and research facilities in Hawaii have kept marine mammals in captivity, both for entertainment and research. But pressure is mounting to end the practice. With plans in the works for a new dolphin encounter attraction in Ko'olina, what's the future for marine mammals in captivity in Hawaii? We always like to hear from viewers like now to our guest for tonight's show. Lorraine Garnier is a member of the group Empty the Tanks Hawaii, which is part of a worldwide campaign against the cetacean captivity industry. Empty the Tanks Hawaii is opposed to the continued breeding and captivity of dolphins at parks and hotels here, specifically at Sea Life Park and Dolphin Quest venues across the state. Brenda Jensen was recently named Dean of the College of Natural and Computational Sciences at Hawaii Pacific University, and her primary research is in marine toxicology. Professor Jensen's specific focus is on how human-caused stressors impact species such as whales and dolphins. Professor Jensen is an advocate of keeping marine mammals in captivity for research purposes. Tricia Kehaulani Watson is an environmental and cultural resource conservation specialist and the founder of Honua Consulting, a company that consults on projects that benefit Hawaii and the Native Hawaiian community. As a Native Hawaiian herself, Ms. Watson has deep ties to the cultural implications of keeping marine mammals in captivity, but also understands the benefits of marine mammal research. Lindy Leslie was a marine education specialist with the Pacific Whale Foundation on Maui for nearly 2 years and is currently spearheading a petition to end dolphin captivity in Hawaii. Recently, Ms. Leslie met with Governor Ige about the petition, which has so far garnered 109,000 signatures. Insights on PBS Hawaii reached out to Sea Life Park and Dolphin Quest, both of which have dolphins in captivity here in Hawaii. We invited them to be part of our panel tonight, but they declined. Ms. Leslie, maybe we start with you. Can you tell us about this petition?
Yes, I started this petition about a year ago now, and it is on change.org. And it's made available for people around the world. This is an issue that people around the world can speak to, since tourism is a big part of this industry.
And what are you hoping to accomplish? Are you wanting to have this actually come before the legislature in terms of possible law?
Yes, exactly. This petition is petitioning a phase-out process, a phase-out that would phase out the exhibition of captive cetaceans, which are dolphins, whales, and porpoises.
Well, let's go around the panel. Professor Jensen, some sort of phasing out of this, what would be at jeopardy doing something like that in terms of research?
Well, there's a few things that are affected by a phase-out process. First of all, there's so much of, I feel like we're just scratching the surface on understanding the biology of marine mammals. The field has grown tremendously in recent decades, and honestly, there has been a disproportionate amount of information, I think, coming from the captive dolphins that are available, captive marine mammals that are available for scientists to study. And so having the ability to have those baseline health parameters that are very well known and very easy to characterize in controlled situations, that would be at risk by not having the animals available. And then also just having the ability to test instruments that actually could be used for wild populations. You know, you actually don't want to go out into the wild and try a really expensive instrument that is to be attached with suction cups and have it actually disappear into the great blue because you didn't have the chance to test it on the actual skin of a marine mammal.
And see if it works.
And see if it works. And there's any number of things that are important. And just with a phase-out process, just having an aging population, that'll become less and less representative of the actual population in the wild.
All right, and not have that age group. Ms. Garnier, if I understand your position correctly, rather than phase out, you would actually like to see all animals released, not a phase out program. Am I correct in saying that, or is that not accurate?
Well, you don't want to just release a bunch of cetaceans out into the wild and have them fend for themselves. Obviously, the most important thing is that there is a process. There is an agreement with the parks and the people that can put a sea sanctuary together, and they can slowly teach the mammal to rehabilitate, and that takes a great deal of planning. But the planning is in work, and there are actually organizations now that are putting things down on paper and guidelines to where sea sanctuaries can be a real possibility for many countries in the near future. So again, it would be a gradual rehabilitation close to the areas where the dolphins are most closely related to. And then if there are some that are healthy enough and they are trial error back and forth to see if they can actually live in the wild, then those would be the ones that would be released. The others, though, could continue to live at least in the ocean, with stimulation and catching their own food, and they would be taught that over the process of rehabilitation.
And in terms of the value of having those animals continue to be available for research, that for you doesn't sort of balance out your concerns?
I'm not really here to talk about research today. It's really more about the entertainment industry and marine life.
And that you oppose that?
I oppose that.
And so research, but would you make an exception for research, or?
Well, based on the facilities on Oahu right now, talking about the 3 entertainment parks, I wouldn't want to use any of those in regards to, if there was something that needed to be done in regards to research or a facility created in some way where this animal would not be there their whole life, and maybe they came in through a stranding or something. But it's right now, the way things are, it's entertainment only, and it's not appropriate for these intelligent beings.
Ms. Watson, do you believe that it's entertainment only?
I don't. I've had the good fortune of, one, I think people need to realize that the marine mammal conservation world is a very large and complicated network of people. There isn't any group that I think does simply just one thing. So I'll take an example we were talking about right before the show started. So Sea Life Park, which people perceive to be simply an entertainment facility, actually has shown willingness, and in my own personal experience, I've sat on this, to take non-releasable monk seals that really would have honestly otherwise been put to death if not for the willingness of some of these facilities to take in, pay for on their own, the husbandry and care of these animals that cannot be released into the wild. So I think it's important for people to understand, like Brenda said, there is what people perceive at the surface, and then there is everything below that. And it's incredibly complicated. I don't believe you can just, there's even a mechanism to release animals that were born into captivity back into the wild. I think it is, I don't believe that you should go and see animals necessarily in the wild. It's why there's about to be a spinner dolphin rule about not going to visit these animals in the wild. Because I have worked for years, personally worked for years, on trying to institute viewing guidelines for ecotour companies, and have personally gone to these bays where the tour companies have essentially in many cases crippled local communities, saturating them by tourists coming in. So I think to say, just going to the wild is not recognizing that any one thing that happens is sort of a butterfly effect on almost everything else. And it's a far more complicated and nuanced discussion, but conservation management always is. So I think that's, and Brenda and I have worked together for years. I think if anything, that is our hope, is that people realize that conservation management and policy is very, very complex. And we do have many people who are very, very dedicated to the conservation of marine mammals across the board. And it's really a matter of collectively deciding as a local community what steps to take forward and not have that driven by bad information or misinformation. And I think that happens a lot in conservation.
So let's talk about steps that you're interested in. Ms. Leslie, what would be intermediate steps, if you will, that would make you feel better about the lives of marine mammals that are in captivity? Is there anything that you can see as sort of a middle ground in that?
Well, I do think that, like the phase-out process, I think that animals that are living in captivity shouldn't be replaced, and that this should be the last generation of cetaceans in captivity. I personally don't see how you can get research, you can base your research of a wild population on a captive population, because the captive population is not displaying natural behavior, so it's an inaccurate depiction of how an animal would act. So I don't understand that. I think that there's ways that you could improve the facilities. I think that the entertainment needs to stop. I think that's a total inaccurate representation of how the animal acts for the people you're trying to educate them. It's misleading. In the wild, you're not supposed to approach or feed an animal, yet these facilities are having dolphin encounters where they're feeding the animals, they're riding the animals. That doesn't teach us proper stewardship. That doesn't teach us how to take care of the animals. So a lot of that stuff definitely needs to stop until a phase-out process can occur.
Professor Johnson, would you agree in terms of the entertainment component?
Well, I'm not exactly sure how you define that. Definitely there's entertainment with the dolphin encounters, but that's not, when we're talking about facilities on Oahu, that's not all that we have available. And so, we have facilities such as Dolphin Quest that have a very clear and consistent message about research, education, and conservation. And I would argue that there's a good argument that the behaviors that they're displaying are in fact natural. To be able to, the behaviors that and there has been a huge change in the ethic of even the shows across the nation, I would say. The training is, using positive reinforcement. The animal only does what they wish to do at that moment. And so they get positive reinforcement, but nothing is withheld. And then the behaviors that are being displayed as a part of the show, are not the silly behaviors that used to be very, very standard, but more showing the audience, what this animal can do, and you do see the same behaviors in the wild. Now, there's fine lines there, and there's arguments against what I understand that there will be arguments at this table about whether or not there's natural behaviors. But when you're keeping an animal in a shallow lagoon, which is actually similar to their natural habitat, because these animals actually came from coastal populations and they're descendants of the Indian River lagoon system in Florida, these are actually not unnatural habitats for these animals.
And in terms of the point of how do you study animals in captivity as a basis for your understanding of animals in the wild, is it possible to use a captive population for research and extrapolate from that the behavior and the knowledge that we need for animals in the wild?
Well, I certainly think so. We use other mammals to represent us for medical studies. Even rodents can replace a human for initial studies, and so certainly having a bottlenose dolphin, even if it's from the Atlantic, represent a species in Hawaii. There are always going to be species-specific differences, but you can get a lot closer to the question that you're ultimately trying to address by utilizing that particular individual.
Ms. Garnier, I sense you have a lot of thoughts. Your response to those points?
Well, natural habitat in captivity. Well, that's kind of an oxymoron. Dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, are deep diving and they're free ranging. In general, a bottlenose dolphin swims about 40 miles a day. That would take a dolphin from Sea Life Park going from Makapu'u all the way out to Haleiwa, and one from Hawaii-Kai's side, Kahala, all the way out to the west side. So that's a daily jaunt for a bottlenose dolphin. They do spend time in shallow water, but they don't spend all their time in shallow water. They do a lot of deep diving. The squid are deep. You know, the fish and all the other components of the ocean are stimulating for them. You know, so to say that to be in a pool, you know, that maybe is circular. There's one at one park that's just circular, and there's 3 dolphins in there. And they're exposed to people all day long that the park is open. And the shows they put on there are to very loud music with clapping audience, and they're spinning around with a ball on their nose. This is not, I've never seen any dolphin in the wild ever act like that, ever. That's just one of many examples. But these are intelligent, socially cognitive animals. They've got a lot going on. There's Dr. Lori Marino is a neuroscientist, and she studied them for 20 years. And she found out that they're self-actualized. And there's an experiment that she did where she would put a grease pin, a circle, underneath a flipper or a tail fin, and the dolphin would go down in front of the mirror that she had set up in a captive environment. And they would look for that actual dot on their body, turn their body, and that's a self-actualization. That's something that you and I do, you know. So these are highly intelligent mammals that we're trying to keep in small confines and saying, you know, if you entertain and make us a little money, maybe we can do some research. But so little research has come out of the parks here in Hawaii. Most of the research has been more on the breeding level, breeding and selling into other parks across the nation. So I cannot see any natural environment in that regard. No matter what a captive environment tries to do, it is not anything near the wide open ocean, the vibrant, clear blue, wide open ocean.
Okay, let's go to some questions. This question is for Dr. Watson. As a Native Hawaiian activist, how do you feel about Sea Life Park using these animals to generate income for the state and promoting tourism?
Well, I'll talk about Sea Life Park. Well, maybe I'll talk about all the parks, and then I'll talk specifically about Sea Life Park. So Maui Ocean Center and the aquarium both have had tremendous, so Maui Ocean Center had a very long-standing and outstanding partnership with Kahu Charlie Maxwell. So if you go there, their interpretive program is outstanding. It's phenomenal. And I really think perhaps it is the go-to standard. I think the aquarium also has an incredible interpretive exhibit that deals with culture and the role of ocean and culture. And I think in many ways, those 2 sites were ahead of the curve. I worked a lot with Uncle Charlie on this issue over a number of years. And I know that Sea Life Park is certainly evolving in that direction. My husband actually does a cultural seminar for all of their interns that come in. So they have certainly shown an interest in moving in that direction, which actually dovetails in what my answer to all of this is going to be. It's not just about the entertainment versus the research. These are huge educational portals for people. When my son loves ocean animals, just loves them, and he doesn't have opportunities otherwise to encounter sharks or dolphins. It certainly didn't as a child, right? We went to Sea Life Park all the time because he loved it. Is it perfect? No. But for children on islands, especially from rural communities that don't necessarily have the opportunity to drive somewhere else and do other things, they're institutions, right? I mean, I can't even imagine something like Sea Life Park shutting down. So again, could it be better on the education of culture, culture? Absolutely. But I think that's more a lack of financial resources than a lack of willingness on their part. And my hope is, and again, I've worked on fundraising for their captive facilities, especially for monk seals that I didn't want to see put down otherwise. So that particular seal was an incredibly sad situation. It had to be taken out of the wild population. It had nowhere to go. Sea Life Park was the only facility that stood up and stepped in. So again, there are individual situations where I think they become educational opportunities. So I think you have to look at it at a more complex level than is it just entertainment and ecotourism? It's education, it's research, it's all of these things combined. And that in its entirety, I would not want to see lost.
Right. Thank you. This question is from Faye in Hawaii Kai. What does the research show about how captive dolphins feel when in captivity? May I start with you on that, Professor Jensen?
Sure. So that's an interesting word, feel. It's not very easy to quantitate. But what is very well studied in these animals is the stress levels. And so actually looking at the hormonal levels in various situations to measure stress. And so in that regard, I mean, there certainly are stressful situations that they encounter. Moving the animal is probably among the most stressful, where they've actually been able to record major changes in cortisol levels, for example. There can be other disturbances in their environment that can cause stress, but by and large, they do hit a baseline level of stress. And then there are other indicators of stress that are behavioral that they look for, and that there is a national a group that certifies these parks and actually looks for levels of stress and indication of behavioral problems. Mm-hmm. And so it is certainly not my, I do not know, like from park to park, how much those are going to be evident in their populations, but there are standards for such things. And so the most important thing for small cetaceans is to be able to provide that social interaction. Mm-hmm. And so if the park and the facility is able to provide, enough of a social structure and, provide that interaction that they need, and they absolutely need it, then they can be stress-free.
Without naming names, and have you visited parks nationally or internationally and seen conditions that do make you upset, and you do think, I would rather not see an animal in this setting?
Yes.
And what are those? What sort of things are to you sort of really alarming conditions?
Well, when there are tanks that would seem to be too small, or would seem to not have a whole lot of stimulation or ability to move from tank to tank for proper maintenance and that sort of thing. There are some aged facilities that, like Kehao said, they would love to upgrade, but finances might prevent that. But the standard, I think, from the days of flipper, that have changed a lot. And so there are ways of making an environment stimulating and at least better.
And improved. Ms. Leslie, obviously the stress factor on animals is of concern to you. Mm-hmm. What are the behaviors or conditions that are alarming to you?
I think whenever you look at the marine mammal report of the dolphins that have died in these parks in Hawaii, it's been from things like malnutrition, trauma, stillbirth, stuff that is just alarming to me. And there's been things that show up on the report that really wouldn't happen in the wild. For example, jumped out of tank, that sort of thing.
Would be the...
But hold on, there are things that happen in the wild that could never happen in captivity, right? Like cryptococcus and toxoplasmosis. So we just had a dolphin, was it a dolphin? In Waimanalo, not even a month ago, that died from toxoplasmosis. But because of the standards that control, the water quality in tanks, you're never going to see that in captivity. So that argument goes both ways. I mean, I think that's, again, why there's a bigger picture. So you don't have animals dying from being hit from propellers or dying from these diseases that come from feral cats, which we're seeing more and more of. So I think my understanding is we see more animals coming up from strandings in the wild than are dying in captivity. And that's, again, part of it is understanding that comparison of conditions that can be controlled in captivity versus the work that Brenda does with understanding these very serious diseases and various toxins that are killing marine mammals in the wild. So again, I think you can't look at any of this vacuously. You have to look at it in the much broader picture of what does marine conservation in Hawaii and even the larger Pacific entail, and how do all of these components play into that larger picture. So, I mean, that argument swings both ways.
Ms. Garnier, your thoughts on this, on the stressors for the animals in captivity?
Well, I did want to preface it that anything going on with monk seal research or rehabilitation is not of my concern. I think it's really valuable to have a place for monk seals.
And what's the difference for you between why is it valuable with monk seals versus dolphins?
Because I believe monk seals being locally born and raised here, that if they are able to get better in a rehabilitation situation and can be released nearby at some point, that's been very effective here so far. And just like the marine mammal centers in Laguna Beach and up in San Francisco, you know, I spent many a weekend up there, and you know, I just think the work that they're doing is amazing. So my conversation tonight's about not necessarily about monk seals, but as far as, you know, an animal, or let's say a cetacean, specifically dolphins, getting hit by a propeller, very unfortunate, but they've had their whole life in the ocean. Maybe they were young when they died, but they have an opportunity to live in this very stimulating and normal environment for them, very vibrant. In captivity, I'm going to just take one park in particular. They have 230 deaths of dolphins and sea lions. 115 of those came from the wild. Now 42 of those are right from our own waters. They were spinner dolphins and spotted. And the 8 spotted only lived up to 2 months period. That was it. But it was interesting. I was reading today, there was something released today on all the rehabilitations and releases since the early 60s that people have done over the years around the world. And it was 17 pages with multiple listings. And there were 4 releases from Sea Life Park in the 70s and the 80s. And they knew that at some point that these animals couldn't survive. As most of us know, spinners, you know, they rest during the day and they deep dive in late afternoons and evenings for their squid. So to bring them into a captive situation doesn't make any sense, because they would be resting during the day when they'd have to be performing. So I can see why none of that particular dolphin survived. I can see that. But there are so many parks in the world. There's thousands of parks around the world. And this is one park that in 50 years has had 230 deaths. So, I mean, we have to go, okay, rehabilitation, and if there's research in rehabilitation, but eventually released back to the wild, if that animal can be released back to the wild, would be the only thing I would ever imagine. And this is me talking personally. I'm not talking about the 2,000 people that have signed petitions in the last couple of months, between Lindy's petition with 110,000 and the New Atlantis one with 91,000, written by Lila Jones. There's a lot of people wanting change because of parks around the world that are not able to maintain longevity for their animals.
All right.
And mammals.
Tonight we're discussing life in captivity, caring confinement. Questions from Tom in Waikiki. If we terminate captive programs for entertainment, would more people try to see these animals in the wild? Ms. Leslie, is that a concern of yours, and some of the issues of animals being maybe overwhelmed in the wild if these programs are terminated?
I think that I would speak to what she had to say earlier, that I think there does need to be proper management of viewing animals in the wild. I think that I'd also like to comment on what she spoke about earlier about education. This is all coming from a girl who grew up in Oklahoma, who was fascinated with dolphins and whales. I was landlocked, but yet there was still this passion about this animal, even though I was not surrounded by the animal. I taught myself everything. So I think more than anything, I live on Maui Ocean Center, cutting edge. as you mentioned earlier, but there's no captive marine mammals there. In Maui, it's been banned since 2002, so all of Maui County has no captive marine mammals, and we're still able to teach the kids, the local kids, and the tourists about marine life there.
Do you think that's true? Do you think it's possible to provide the same level of excitement or education to those, children without that component?
Gosh, I have thought about this a lot because I truly feel that the feeling, well, these animals are ambassadors. Those that can come and be close to the public, there's something about that experience. And with all the conversations lately about SeaWorld and dolphins in captivity here, I wonder with HD, wonderful, big screen TVs and beautiful filming, and could that be a substitute for that excitement and that feeling? And I'm not sure that it is. I think that there's just something that really it's very hard to measure because you just don't know how you've impacted that 12-year-old and what decision they're going to make about what career they go into and their conservation ethic that they go forward with. Those are very hard things to quantitate, but I do feel that the marine mammals in captivity, despite, and things have only improved, husbandry, because of all the work that has been done to study these animals, their conditions have gotten better and better. And I do feel that personal encounter is still very important for pushing ocean ethics in the right direction.
All right. Any other thoughts on that before I move on?
I agree with Brenda. And I do a lot of conservation work. I mean, it's our lives. And so I think there is a danger to this concept that you can just replace a live encounter with anything, whether it be a dolphin or a national park, with an HD anything, because it doesn't replicate that specific encounter. And I think as a community, we're already becoming too desensitized to nature. We're thinking an Instagram post somehow can replicate the experience of walking through the Grand Canyon National Park. And it doesn't. I mean, there is something about, and it's all about management. At the end of the day, if you are managing experiences and resources and engagement effectively, then you should be able to negate any adverse impacts, whether to specific species or to a park that's been overrun with tourists. It's all about really, because as someone who has tried to deal with some of these wildlife encounters, it is so much easier said than done. Because unless you're going to try to legislate it, in which case you're looking for an absolute fight on your hands. We had that. It was Dolphin Smart, right? Wasn't that it? Dolphin Smart? The federal government has already tried to do volunteer programs to get people to engage. It didn't work. So again, I think we have the fortune of having a very different vantage point, of having a lot of education behind us, a lot of experience behind us, that just says this is a very complex issue and it's ultimately a management one. And like Brenda said, there are the complexity of laws and regulations on the books that help to manage the care of these animals, I think is really the answer. I think it is, and I think maybe it was before the show or during the show, who advises the government, who advises these parks? And I think that's so much the solution, is how do we become a community that engages in what these facilities look like, what they should be doing or not doing, as opposed to sort of just this culture of conflict, because that doesn't work at the end of the day. How do we become a community that finds collective solution instead of just rushing to be contentious?
What changes might you want to see?
I would love to see a world-class facility, much bigger, facility. I mean, I don't agree, I don't disagree with the idea that we should have as much stimulation as possible, wonderful giant facilities for these animals. But I also, again, I mean, and I believe that of any captive animal experience, whether it's the zoo or Sea Life Park or Maui Ocean Center, because I believe so much in island children who don't necessarily have a lot of other opportunities to be able to engage with these animals in a safe setting. And having grown up with that personally, having seen my own child inspired by that, I wish we had more programs where these institutions would let children in for free, because I do believe that is how you perpetuate a culture of care towards nature and a culture of a very deep-seated innate conservation ethic that inspires local children to go into conservation, to go to the university, to major in these fields, and then to get conservation jobs. And I think for me, that is the perfect world, where we have inspired local children to go into conservation work and take care of all of the resources of Hawaii for themselves.
All right. Yes,
I
Ms.
just want
Garnier.
to say one thing. Last night, I get an email from explore.org about every 3 days of a new activity, whether it's orcas on the rubbing beach up in Vancouver or it's an osprey nest up in Alaska. Right there, cam set up, I get to watch the osprey eagle with its baby feeding it. I would never get a chance to see that. Do I want to go sit in the nest with it and touch it and kiss it? I don't need to do that. I learn a lot by watching this live cam that's placed out of sight where they can't see it. Just like the whale sanctuary project.org that's coming up. Their idea is that they will place these sanctuaries in a place where those mammals will never see the human population again. They'll film it and they'll be able to do a 3D or a 2D live and right into wherever they need to do it. And people can watch these mammals in the wild again. There are lots of wonderful things and opportunities out there for people to see these mammals in the wild, maybe even closer up. A real famous video that just came out recently, and they're doing them all up and down Southern California because there's so many mammals right now, is these, just marine mammals basically being caught by a drone, chasing after their prey. We can never see that. It's never going to be shown in an entertainment park where you have to pay $130 or $250 to ride on a dorsal fin. There's no education there. That's not educational to me. So explore.org is a great alternative tonight. Check it out after the show.
So I'm going to follow up on that really quick. I'll say, I sit on the U.S. Marine Protected Area Federal Advisory Commission. And I sat on the Whale Sanctuary for 8 years. And I know MPAs. And I believe that is true to a point. But again, it's balance. And I think as someone who sits on more advisory councils than I can count when it comes to protected areas, there is also a huge campaign to get kids outdoors, to get people to see national parks. We're the centennial of the National Park Service. More than ever, people are saying get outside and have experiences. So it's balance. I concur that there are many places and things we will never get to see, and it's wonderful where technology can help there, and innovation's important there, especially for things like no-take zones and enforcement. But I would hate to, like that movie WALL-E, right? Where all our experiences are purely, where our kids are not outside, where our kids, instead of taking them outdoors to experience these things, we're somehow saying that something that's on a computer screen is a surrogate for being in amongst nature. I think I would never want to see that happen.
Then go to nature. Go to nature. Buy a nice pair of binoculars instead of spending it on being pulled by a dolphin or touching dolphins everywhere. Imagine what the dolphins are going through all this. We have to forget, this is about the mammals. This show's really about the mammals. It's not about us with regulations. It's about these mammals that are held in these captive situations. So take that money, go buy yourself a nice pair of binoculars and drive out to the beach early in the morning when the pods are going by. You can see a lot from shore. And if you do get onto a kayak or onto a boat and you have another opportunity, then hopefully the guidelines will be followed. There are guidelines there, and maybe more guidelines will be coming up in June with Dolphin Smart. That's something they're trying to do. But you can see a lot. Let's say don't even go out on the ocean, just from shore. You can see a lot. When we were doing the whale count this year, we saw multiple pods going down the coast, the west coast, out on the Makaha side. But we also saw boat companies dropping people in right on top of them. So there's not a lot of safety out there for our wild populations. But what I'm saying is you can see in the wild. I agree. Take your kids, take your friends out to the beaches and see them. Absolutely. But there are also alternatives if you are at home, and we know everyone's technology oriented right now to see these also.
All right, let's go to another question from Keoki and Mililani. Are we wrong to believe people and dolphins are equal in terms of intelligence? Professor Jensen, your thoughts on that?
Not equal, but I would say that certainly, again, this is the captive population that has completely changed our understanding of the cognitive abilities of dolphins and killer whales and other animals that have successfully been reared in captivity. So they are impressive animals, and so there has been so much work that has really revealed things that we need to know about their wild counterparts, about just, it was sort of an earth-shattering conclusion, but one that's completely supported with anthropology, is that killer whales have culture. But that was not very well known. It was really a combination of the cognitive abilities, the types of communication that they were actually participating in captivity, along with those wild observations that complemented each other very well, and to be able to come to that conclusion ultimately. And so that is something that very, very important, is their cognitive ability. And so with that is, I guess, what is the measurement for the suffering that's implied with the animals? And so that's very important to get at. And so again, those quantitative measures that I mentioned before, and not every park or facility is going to be equal, but it's very important to really take not assume that they're suffering, I think.
All right. This question is to Lorraine and Lindy. Where did you see your first marine mammal, and do you think it was a valuable experience?
Yes, I do think it was a valuable experience because it kind of shaped everything. I did see my first marine mammal in a marine park. My mother took me there. She was completely she did it for the same reasons she does it for her child. I was fascinated by animals, and my mom thought she was doing a good thing. She had great intentions. This girl loves animals. I'm going to take her to see this marine life. And I went there, and then there's just something wrong about it, I felt, over the years. And so I remember shortly after that, for Christmas, I asked my mother for a Christmas gift, and I wanted to, I was so upset because the children in my 5th grade class in another classroom adopted a dolphin. And I was like, I want to adopt a dolphin. Why didn't my class get to do that? So that Christmas, my mother adopted me a dolphin. Still remember, a whale, a humpback whale. Still remember his name today as Onyx. And that was what shaped my career path, shaped my passion. And right after I finished grad school, I moved to Maui to save the whales, so to speak.
All right, do you remember your first?
I do. We were on a sailing trip out of Newport Beach to Catalina on a sailboat, and potted dolphins were alongside.
All right. Let's take these questions in tandem. They touched on the same issue. From Frank in Kona, could researchers get enough grant money without relying on the money generated by the entertainment factor of parks? And from Renee in Honolulu, why not just have research facilities, but not entertainment facilities?
So you're laughing because we know how much government funding has dried up around research. And I think, again, back to at least that one experience with the monk seal, there wasn't government funding. I think there's been such fluctuating financial resources from government and private sector coming in for the marine mammal sector. That's just would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Putting it mildly. So I think, and again, that's where it takes a village to really sort of address the magnitude of need. I think people don't realize how much valuable information not only comes from the captive care facilities, but from the stranding programs about ocean health generally. And there is so to answer the question, no, there's not enough just grant resources. That you do have to, unfortunately, find ways to diversify your income streams. And I think really we're doing the best we can with the magnitude of the problem with the resources we have available. And it has been a struggle to make sure that we are, finding out about our ocean around us. Every time a lot of these lab reports come back, I don't want to know half the time, but it's serious and it's important. And really they have been partners in that. So, and maybe one day there will be enough funding and then we can have this conversation again, but we are where we are right now and there's not enough grant funding.
At the top of the show, we mentioned this Atlantis project that we're all hearing about, and that's in such early stages. But based on what they have done at other properties, is this welcome news to you that something like this is coming to Oahu, or unwelcome?
I don't know enough about Atlantis. I think I would be much more comfortable if it were Disney or an entity that I know has an extraordinary track record of conservation. I don't know Atlantis is. So I think it is very much a case-by-case basis. I think the entities that are here have been here a very long time and have proven themselves to be valued partner in a larger network. And again, I think a group like Disney, were they to open something, so I don't know if it's a partnership, Disney has one of the most extraordinary conservation programs perhaps in the world. So I don't know enough about Atlantis. And I will say, if it turns out they have a very bad track record, or if we get there and the tanks are very small and this is pure entertainment and they don't want to work with anybody else, then I would be opposed. Because I think, like Brenda said, you want the standard and the care to be there, and you want there to be an educational component, and you want there to be a research component, and you want anybody who comes into our conservation community to be a partner in conservation and not a problem for the conservation community.
All right. For Professor Jensen, from Rob in Ainahaina, how do the researchers feel about just using abandoned, injured animals instead of breeding in captivity? Is that an option to move toward?
That's a great question, and kind of brings, we haven't actually discussed rehabilitation. So there is a danger in having all of your information come from sick animals and animals that perhaps are species that are not going to do well long-term in captivity. So I want to go back to the word balance, because I really think that rehab is something that we haven't had that for quite some time in Hawaii, and that would be something that would be very welcome to have, research and rehabilitation.
For injured animals coming in?
Yes.
There's a facility on the Big Island?
For monk seals.
For monk seals.
Right, for monk seals I meant, yes. But for injured dolphins,
Right.
not an option.
Right.
All right. So that is something that you'd like to see an expansion of?
Yes, but I don't think that it actually replaces the populations that are actually long-term residents. There's different things that you get from each population. So one is not a substitute for the other.
All right. Lindy, do the release advocates apply the same idea to land mammals, e.g. dogs, animals in the zoo? From Lloyd in Waianae. And I think the question there is, what's special about dolphins that they're at the forefront of your mind on this? Why not other animals?
Well, I think, first of all, a confined tank is a lot different than the open ocean. And I think an animal that is designed to live in the open ocean, but keeping it in a tank is very, very hard on it. It's just not healthy for the animal. And I think that a dog is a lot different.
I think, or zoo animals, let's take that as a comparison. So is that of equal importance to you?
It is of importance to me, but this petition that I wrote is focused on cetaceans. It's due to a long passion that I've had. But I don't think that Dr. Naomi Rose says something like, it is not our right to see an animal. And there's a lot of, I think there's a sense of like, I have the right to see this animal. And there's a lot of animals out there I may never see, but that doesn't mean I don't respect it. That doesn't mean I'm not connected with nature. That doesn't mean that I want to not help it. I mean, I've never seen a lot of animals out there that I truly like to educate myself on and just know that I'm taking care of and being a voice for.
All right. Lorraine, your thoughts on that?
Well, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about Atlantis coming in and more about the World Conservation Council coming here in September. And they're coming here specifically to talk about sustainability and conservation from, you know, the lands and the oceans for all people. And how sad it's going to be when they find out it's enough that we already have 3 captive facilities that are focused on entertainment. I wish they were focused more on education and research. You don't get many questions answered when it comes to educating the public about what's actually going on with these mammals in captivity. The education component is nil at a couple of the parks. I mean, there's nothing. A lot of them don't even know which type of dolphin it is. But going back to the World Conservation Council, I mean, how are they going to feel when they find out, wow, this is about sustainability and conservation, yet you're having a 4th park come in to Hawaii to have a captive swim with dolphin program? How are they going to feel about that? And I want to just say one thing, and if you hope you don't mind, I'm going to look at this card. Sylvia Earle, who's a famous ocean scientist, just said a few days ago, okay, this event in Hawaii is at a critical time for protection of our natural resources and our oceans. Nothing else matters if we fail to make peace with nature. And that's Sylvia Earle coming out and talking about the importance of this Conservation Council coming to Hawaii.
So first is the World Conservation Congress, because I sit on the host committee.
Excuse me.
And I've worked on it for bringing it here for 8 years. So and Brenda and IUCN is a member. So I don't think we can speak for what their response will be, because I sit on a number of advisory bodies for the IUCN. And I don't think they're going to be particularly concerned about this issue. So I think that, again, we're straying a little bit. But as someone who has worked on this Congress for many, many years, I do think it's an important Congress. And I think, again, we are bringing the world leaders in conservation here. And having been part of it for years and years and years at this point, again, I think it's a move towards balance, right? I mean, I think, how do you deal with management collectively? How do you deal with these issues as a whole? So I don't know if I would speak to that, because I know that organization very, very, very well. And I don't think that would be their position.
All right, moving forward in terms of achieving that balance, one viewer asked, what would it cost for those world-class research facilities that the researchers spoke about? Is it possible to build something here in Hawaii that achieves sort of the type of ideal freedom for the animals if they are kept in research and in captivity?
Oh my goodness, I couldn't possibly venture, you know, with the development projects that we've been observing over the past several years, like the rail project, and just even a simple, you know, building renovation in downtown Hawaii, you know, costs just can expand so quickly. So I can't possibly venture to put a number on what it would cost, but suffice it to say, it's something that's well beyond research grant money that's available in this country, and so it has to come, you know, from business side, and it has to come, you know, from a deep pocket that has a real passion for it.
And I want to actually tag on to something that was said earlier about people who have this innate, I cannot see an animal and love it. So, you know, a number of the monk seals, the number of animals we have in captivity are monk seals. And it was my husband and I who were the ones who went out after people started killing monk seals. What people don't realize is that is not everybody's position, to be naturally, I would never harm an animal. That's just the reality of our community here, is that these facilities, if it offers you an opportunity to see an animal up close, that is a huge opportunity to potentially change people who in many cases have not always been amicable to certain animals in our community. So again, I think, and there isn't enough grant money available, and in many cases, people don't think government funds should be going to the treatment of this. They do think it should be coming from the private sector, because in a world of competing needs, this is not everybody's top priority. I mean, people talk about why should it go to this when there's homelessness, or we have needs for education, or our classrooms are hot. And that's fair. So again, I think that's why we work very hard to partner with private entities that do find ways to bring in money to build out not just facilities, but programming, because it has been so critical in really educating an overall community about our treatment of marine mammals generally. And that's really critical.
All right, and a final word on this issue. You're hoping that this will be before the legislature next session, so we'll be all hearing about this issue in the year to come. Thank you all so much for the spirited and very interesting conversation. Mahalo to all of you for watching tonight. For all the questions and comments, join us next week as we explore the state of our zoo. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums recently denied the Honolulu Zoo's request to renew its accreditation due to potential safety concerns, inconsistent leadership, and political wrangling. But city leaders and zoo officials say they're determined to turn things around. Join the zoo's director and animal advocates for the Honolulu Zoo, A Fall from Grace. That's next time on PBS, on Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Leah Maddock. Ahui ho.